This is the third part of the cardiovascular system, part 3. So we're going into the vasculature, the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. So starting with the major blood vessels, arteries, and veins, they're now literally the tubes that carry and deliver blood around our body. So truly, I always think of it as a plumbing network, and these would be the pipes. So starting with the very simple definition of an artery, even though it is correct here, arteries start at the semilunar valves of the heart, leading right into the arteries. And arteries, of course, carry blood away from the ventricles. So it's the direction of flow away from the heart, specifically away from the ventricles. And this third bullet point, you see most arteries, yeah, this is true, most arteries are carrying oxygen-rich blood. The exception, of course, now, a major exception, and there are others, would be now the arteries for the pulmonary circuit. These would be arteries that, of course, starting at the right ventricle, carrying blood towards the lungs in order to get refreshed with oxygen. So the pulmonary arteries and its branches, and there are other exceptions, but truly the second point is the definition of an artery. So a vein is really just the opposite. Veins are carrying blood and delivering blood to the atria. And again, most of the veins in our body are carrying the deoxygenated blood. And a major example, once again, is with the pulmonary circuit. So here what's called the pulmonary veins. These are now veins that have oxygen-rich blood fresh from the lungs. And in this case, this oxygen-rich blood of the pulmonary vein is being delivered to the left atrium. So again, this bullet points the rule, and then right here is a major guideline. So there are exceptions. The third blood vessel, very small size capillaries, and what's so important about the capillaries are, this is where we have interaction with the cardiovascular system and the other systems of our body. So material could pass in and out. The flow is both directions. Material could leave the capillaries and diffuse into the tissues, and the reverse. Material from the tissues could pass into a capillary. So there's an interaction with the various organ systems occurring at the capillaries. And down here at the bottom is just a general flow diagram, how veins, as we just said, return blood to the atria, delivering blood into the heart. And the ventricles, of course, pumping blood away via the arteries. We'll see that there are different types of arteries that typically lead down to capillaries. And we'll see there's actually 3 types of capillaries that we'll discuss. And then ultimately what's called a small vein, a venule, and then everything would loop back and complete that cycle. So this is what's known as a circuit, leaving a ventricle, a system of arteries, capillaries, veins, and then leading back to the atria. And in lab, of course, is where we'll cover the names of the major blood vessels. And we just have a description of the circuits again. So a network of arteries, veins, and capillaries. And we have the 2 circuits spelled out here, for example. So the pulmonary circuit, the purpose is to add oxygen to the blood. So in the lungs, the erythrocytes with their hemoglobin could bind oxygen. And a description, again, starting at that pulmonary valve, leading to the pulmonary arteries throughout the lungs, loading up on oxygen. And in this case, the pulmonary veins carrying that oxygen-rich blood back to the left atrium. Whereas now the systemic circuit, again, the network of arteries, capillaries, veins, in this case, their purpose is to deliver oxygen, delivering oxygen to the tissues. So starting from the aortic valve through the aorta and all its branches throughout the body. So delivering that oxygen-rich blood around our system. And then ultimately with the vena cava and the coronary sinus, that oxygen poor blood now, oxygen has been consumed by the organs, and it's now flowing back to the right atrium, and it can start the process over again by pumping that blood back through the pulmonary circuit. So of course, it's the arteries and the veins are the major organs for now delivery of blood around the body, that transport. So we'll start to take a look at the three principal layers, these tunics that are seen in most blood vessels. So the general arrangement, it's described here. And let's go ahead and just start with this illustration. So we see the typical appearance, these three tunics to arteries and veins. Usually that's the appearance, three tunics. There are exceptions we'll see. Arteries have a thicker tunic layer, especially that middle tunica media with a large amount of smooth muscle. And another trait unique to arteries are the amounts of elasticity, the concentration of elastic fibers that we see in the arteries, but not, of course, in the veins. So starting with the tunica, it could be called intima or interna. This is the deepest internal layer of a blood vessel. So that internal lining, the term is endothelium. It's no different from epithelial tissue. It's just epithelium implies that it has a superficial location, but the same type of tissue, the simple squamous with the internal location, we get that term endothelium. So we have that endothelial lining. And again, you notice in arteries, there's a layer of elastic fibers. The middle layer, the tunica media. And again, this is now the smooth muscle layer, the only type of muscle that's in a blood vessel, smooth muscle. Arteries have a higher concentration of smooth muscle, and only the arteries have elastic fibers in this middle layer. Whereas the third layer now, the tunica adventitia, the superficial layer, this is a layer of connective tissue, and the purpose here is serving as an attachment feature, right? That's one trait of connective tissue, binding, attaching structures. So in this case, arteries and veins actually share some of their tunica adventitia, and arteries and veins are connected together. And in turn, they're also bonded on to other structures, such as connected to a bone, connected to a muscle. So the attachment layer. And this is now where we see elastic fibers and collagen fibers in both arteries and veins. And again, it comes from the fact that this is a shared layer between arteries and veins. So they share this tissue of their tunica adventitia. And again, we can see the illustration here again. So arteries have a thicker wall, especially when it comes to their tunica media. And arteries are more elastic, being able to stretch out and recoil back to shape due to that double layer of elastic fibers. So as we start to take a look at the arterial system, we're going to see that there's three different groupings of arteries. And even though they all kind of start to have that three tunic structure, there is a little bit of modification between the different types. So we'll start very close to the heart. So right after the ventricles, we have what's known as elastic arteries. And we'll see how that name makes sense. So these are the arteries directly connected to the ventricles. They're the biggest size arteries. So they have a very big diameter to their lumen, transport a large amount of blood because of that size. However, in proportion to their large luminal size, their tunic layers are not as thick when compared to other types of arteries. So in this case, we're sacrificing the thickness of the walls in favor of the diameter of the lumen, the size of the tube. And specifically, getting to the name an elastic artery, in their tunica media, there's both smooth muscle and elastic fibers. And the name, of course, now really makes sense. There's a higher percentage of elastic fibers in that tunica media. And to allow for that, there's a decreased amount of smooth muscle tissue. So with their high percentage of elastic fibers, these elastic arteries, which are directly connected to those strong contracting ventricles, the pressure of that ventricular systole is transferred right to these elastic arteries, and they have the ability to stretch due to that pressure, and more importantly, recoil back to shape. So they could deal with the pressure changes that are coming from those thick, strong ventricles. And again, these arteries are very close to the heart, and that's exactly where we see these examples here connected to each ventricle. So now we're going to transition a little further away from elastic arteries, and along the length of this tube, along the length of this artery, it'll start to transition to form now this second category of arteries. So what's known as a muscular artery, we now see that they're now smaller in their size, but now we start to have a thicker tunic wall. So really the opposite of what we just said for elastic. Here we're seeing a thicker tunic wall, and now a smaller size to their lumen. The same goes here for the tunica media, just the opposite of an elastic artery. So here now, hence the name, there's a larger amount of smooth muscle tissue in these muscular arteries. And we have now a higher percentage of smooth muscle in the tunica media, and we're now sacrificing to have a decreased amount of elastic fibers. Since these arteries are now further away from those strong contracting ventricles, they have now another purpose, a different purpose, using their smooth muscle. And with more smooth muscle, there's now more ability to regulate the diameter of the arteries. So due to constricting or relaxing the smooth muscle, and again, this is a involuntary function. So with that autonomic nervous system, this involuntary regulation of the blood diameter size, and thus regulating the diameter of arteries regulates the amount of blood that could flow through them. So depending on our need, depending on our behaviors, we could allow for increased blood flow to certain organs or decreasing blood flow to certain organs. We only have a set amount of blood, again, based on our body size. So depending on our activity, we could either allow for more blood to flow to our kidneys and less blood to flow to our muscles. And that would be an example when we're in a resting state. Or the reverse, if we're more active, less blood flowing to the kidneys, more blood flowing to our working skeletal muscles. So again, at this point, we're further away from the heart. And examples, moving up the neck, moving down the appendages. Examples of muscular arteries. So these first two categories have the 3 tunic layers. But now as we get closer to the capillaries, the arterioles, which just means small size arteries. So again, a very small size to their lumen. And now we don't quite have the 3 set defined tunic layers. So again, here's now the exception to the 3 tunic layer not always being the case. However, with their amount of smooth muscle, the arterioles do control how much blood now flows into the capillaries. And again, in turn, branching from an arteriole, that leads to a huge cluster of multiple capillaries. So I think we have a view, I'll kind of skip too quickly, kind of summarizes this. So from the elastic arteries close to the heart, the bigger lumen size with their thinner walls in proportion, more elastic fibers in these areas, and then traveling further away, we now start to see the smaller size to the lumen and the thicker tunic wall, much more smooth muscle in that tunica media. And then we just finished here with the arterial that does not have the 3 complete tunic layers. So let's just go back to our spot here. So the good news is about veins, their tunic layers are quite consistent throughout the body. So instead, we'll take a look at different ways, different adaptations or mechanisms to help circulate the blood through a vein despite the much lower pressure. Arteries have the high pressure because they're directly downstream of those strong cardiac muscle rich ventricles. But the job of a vein, as we started out, is to deliver blood to the atria. Veins have to deliver blood into the pump. So to help with that, we'll discuss 3 different processes, 3 different mechanisms in place, structures in place to help circulate blood through the veins despite the low pressure. And the first one you notice here are valves. So arteries do not have valves. Arteries start after the semilunar valves, but within arteries, there's no valves present. It wouldn't be necessary. As for veins, the veins that are in our appendages, along the length of the veins, along the length of the tunica interna, there's just an outcropping of tissue that forms these valves. And again, everywhere we have valves, that'll keep the blood flowing one direction. So in terms of our appendages, the blood will just flow through one set of valves, flowing in the proximal direction, up your leg, up your thigh. And the valve, of course, shuts behind it, preventing that backflow. And again, the valves themselves are just now an outcropping along the tunica interna, the deepest tunic layer of a vein. 2 other mechanisms. One involves our contracting, working skeletal muscles, and the fact that our blood vessels are surrounded and run between our skeletal muscle organs. Any contraction of the muscle organs puts pressure on the blood vessels, especially the veins with their thinner tunic walls, and that gives additional force to push blood through the veins. So any activity of your arms and legs, any type of exercise, moving around, and just simply muscle tone, just a general degree of contraction in your muscles, aids in its circulation. So this, once again, affects our appendages. So blood flowing in our arms and legs, whereas not the case for the torso. Whereas now the torso, the blood vessels in the torso are now here on this 3rd bullet point. And you notice the name, the thoraco-abdominal pump, thoracic cavity, abdominal cavity pump, or the name here, respiratory pump, really implies how it works. It involves the act of breathing. So due to the pressure changes as our diaphragm contracts and relaxes, that now aids in this suction force. So as we breathe in, as we inhale, and the deeper the inhalation is, the more suction force is generated to pull blood towards the heart. So of course, this is now going to affect the veins that are within the torso. So taking a deep breath, you're not only drawing, of course, oxygen into your lungs, but you're drawing increased amounts of blood and pulling it back towards the heart. And that's the effect of this respiratory pump. So veins use all 3 of these, the one-way valves, the contracting skeletal muscle pump, and we can see those here. So just an illustration of the valves. And again, this would allow the blood in the vein only to flow in the proximal direction, ultimately going back towards the torso. And then right here, we see that contracting gastrocnemius muscle right there as an example, putting pressure right on the structure of the vein, and that additional pressure to help push blood through. And as I mentioned already with veins, there's just simply the naming, the large, the medium, and what's known as venules, a small vein. Whereas arteries had the elastic arteries, muscular arteries, arterioles, and those distinct differences. Again, really not much beyond the size and the presence of valves between different veins. So this section could come to an end here, comparing just the arteries and veins. And again, you notice right here, this is just a nice kind of summary comparison. So I'll just pause here for a moment. And you can stop the video if you need more time. But a good just summary comparison between what we've already discussed. So it's now here the final section, the arteries carrying blood away from the heart, away from the ventricles, the venous system carrying blood towards the heart, specifically towards the atria, but it's now the exchange vessels are the different types of capillaries where we have interaction between the cardiovascular system and the other organ systems of our body. So there's that first term there again, that interaction between the cardiovascular system, which again transports nutrients and oxygen and hormones and waste chemicals, and the various other tissues and organs of our body. So a brief description again about how we transfer material out of the bloodstream. It's the fluid plasma portion with its dissolved contents of gases, nutrients, etc. Plasma can flow and diffuse out of the capillaries and into the tissues. And this would be the delivery mechanism, again, to get all these factors to our organs and tissues. Also, material from the tissues do flow into the capillaries. So the exchange is in both directions, out of the cardiovascular system and into the cardiovascular system. Capillaries, in contrast to arteries and veins, do not have the three tunic structure. Capillaries are extremely thin and delicate, and capillaries also have pores. So there's holes and pores in their tissue. And again, this allows for the ease of diffusion. So a thin, delicate tissue, as well as it's porous. So what we'll take a look at is there's three different types of capillary structures within the body that we'll discuss. So they're extremely small in size, however, very, very extremely numerous. They just have a thin, delicate tissue layer. And again, the material could flow both out of the capillaries and into the capillaries. So with this section comparing the three types of capillary networks, we're going to see two different trends. We're going to see which type is the most common, and then we're also going to discuss the size of the pores that are in the capillary. And you can make the note right here. In the structure of the capillary itself, there are these open pores and gaps. And again, that allows for material with the plasma to flow out or material from the cells to enter in. So the trend that we'll start with here, this first type of capillary we'll tackle is called a continuous capillary. And one trend that we're going to follow is, well, this is the most common type of capillary in the body, the most abundant type. So the next two types of capillaries, they're going to be less and less common. Whereas now the second trend we'll see here in terms of the pore size, continuous capillaries have the smallest sized pore. So in the next two types of capillaries, we're going to see increasing pore size. And it'll be just those two trends that we really want to follow. So again, the continuous capillary, the most common type, so typically the type of capillary we find in most organs of our body. They do have, of course, these pores, gaps in their tissue structure. And again, this happens to be the smallest size pores when compared to the two other types of capillaries. And with this small size pore per cycle, so as fluid plasma passes through the capillaries in one cycle, if it has the small size pore, it has the smallest degree of exchange. Just only so much fluid could pass out and in per cycle through these small size pores. So now as we move to the next type of capillary, it's really the intermediate type, the fenestrated capillaries. And I say the intermediate type because this now has the medium-sized pores, and it's not as common, but it's not the rare type. So again, they're medium-sized pores, so they have an increased amount of exchange when compared to the continuous capillaries. Yeah, there's more exchange both in and out. And again, not nearly as common. So now we see a select number of organs. The kidneys are a great example of where we find fenestrated capillaries. And then the least common with the biggest pores, if we're following the trend, that's the sinusoidal capillary. So now we have the largest pore size, and that's being referenced right here. And keep in mind the endothelial cells, that's the tissue of the capillary itself. The surrounding cells are representing tissue of the liver. So again, we have the big pores seen here between the endothelial cells. So the largest pore size, and with that big opening, so much more fluid could pass in and out. So sinusoidal capillaries have the highest degree of exchange with the cardiovascular system. However, this is the rare type of capillary, so just few organs that actually have this type of capillary itself. And the image here, one little issue I have with the image here, just makes it look like it's just a long, straight pathway. However, sinusoidal capillaries are highly, highly convoluted. So if I made my little sketch, it would look like so. So a real twisted, coiled capillary structure. And we'll actually see this histology a little later in the course. So these twisted, coiled, with very large pores. But again, this is the rare type of capillary. So this section here, we'll just go ahead and omit. We'll leave that till physiology. And now we could add to our flow chart from the beginning. Starting at the ventricles, we first have the bigger lumen with the thinner tunics, more elasticity, the elastic fibers. They can handle that powerful ventricular systole, and they can stretch and recoil. As we travel further away from the heart, it transitions now to having a muscular artery. So the smaller lumen size, the thicker tunics, but of course more muscular. They could contract or relax to allow changes of blood flow to select areas. Starting to shed the three tunic appearance. That's now where we have the smaller arterioles. will then branch depending on the location, depending on the organ, one of those three types of capillaries. So now we could have the interaction with the tissues, and then our small size veins leading and merging to medium sized veins, and then ultimately the large veins, such as the vena cava, are returning blood to the atrium. So again, in total, this would be a pathway through a circuit, like a systemic circuit, for example. The system of arteries, capillaries, and veins. And we'll finish now with this diagram here. So again, we have a set amount of blood based on our body size. So at any given time, you notice very little blood is actually in the chambers of the heart because the heart is beating at such a rapid pace. Blood just quickly rushes in and out. The same goes for, you notice, all of the systemic arteries. So starting from the aorta and all its branches, again, with the strength of the ventricular contraction and the heart rate, blood is quickly passing through systemic arteries. The capillaries are, of course, extremely tiny and small in size. And overall, the pulmonary circuit, the blood vessels for the lungs, again, that's a relatively small amount of blood vessels. So it's here in the systemic venous system, the veins all around our body. This is where the large percentage of blood is located at any given time.